Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're looking at survivors of violence in societies torn apart by civil war. Hello, my name is Jennifer Hudson. I'm Professor of Political Behavior and Head of Department of Political Science at UCL. Welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. This is the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at UCL. Civil war has ravaged too many societies in recent decades, and civil wars leave deep scars long after the fighting is over. Today, our colleague Dr. Kate Cronin-Furman, who is lecturer in human rights and director of the MA in human rights here at UCL, conducts research into the experiences of victims of civil war violence. One of her recently published papers, co-authored with Roxani Krystalli from the University of St. Andrews, focuses on the relatives of people who have been disappeared during conflict. Drawing on deep field research in Sri Lanka and Colombia, it examines how those relatives seek justice and recognition from the state, and how they try to keep the memories of their missing loved ones alive. Kate now joins me to discuss the paper and the vital broader questions that it raises. Kate, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. We're talking here about the relatives of people who have been disappeared during conflict. Now, that concept of people who have been disappeared, rather than just people who have disappeared, may be unfamiliar to some of our listeners. Could you say what it's referring to and why the distinction matters?
Yes, thank you so much for having me on and for the opportunity to discuss this paper. So, as you say, this is a paper about the victims and survivors of forced disappearances. And forced disappearance is a particular human rights violation that arises when the state or agents of the state abduct someone, detain them, take them away somewhere, and maintain a veil of secrecy about what has happened to that person. So it's this kind of dual injury of the person having been taken through state action or state complicity, and that person's loved ones not knowing what's happened to them.
Thank you. And let's just spend a little bit of time talking about the broader context in which we are going to discuss these disappearances. Your research focuses on two countries, a case study of Sri Lanka and Colombia. Can you give us a little bit of the broader context of what was happening in these countries?
Sure. So Sri Lanka is my kind of area of expertise in this paper. My co-author has written the Colombia case study, but I can kind of speak a little bit to both. So Sri Lanka is a case in which a civil war grew out of long-standing inequality between Sri Lanka's majority Sinhalese and minority Tamil populations. After decades of state repression and ethnic pogroms, Tamil resistance turned militant. In 1983, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam declared war on the Sri Lankan state. That conflict would last for 26 years. There were serious violations of human rights committed by both sides to this war. But there was systematic use of torture, sexual violence, and extrajudicial killing by state forces against anyone who was perceived as a militant or affiliated with them. And what received the most attention from international actors, from the international community, was the mass slaughter of Tamil civilians at the end of the war. So the military illegally shelled civilian targets, including hospitals, which resulted in the deaths of an estimated 40,000 people. However, there was also a long-standing practice, throughout the conflict, and not solely targeted at the Tamil minority community, of the state disappearing dissidents, suspected militants, journalists, family members of people suspected of militant involvement. And as a consequence, Sri Lanka has one of the highest rates of disappearances in the world.
And how extensive is this phenomenon of disappearances outside of the Sri Lankan and Colombian context with which you look at? Is this a widespread type of practice?
It absolutely is. And it came to kind of prominence or international recognition, I would say, most associated with the military juntas in Latin America before kind of the wave of democratic transitions then there. So what we saw, and it's theorized that this was partially in response to kind of the rise of an international human rights movement monitoring, extrajudicial killings, for instance, that some state apparatuses decided, okay, we get in big trouble if there are bodies on the ground. So what happens if you just never have a body? So there were, very well-known cases of military regimes in the Southern Cone, for instance, taking people up in helicopters and dropping them into the ocean so that, it was never known what became of them. And we've seen this all around the world. Iraq, Afghanistan, both have very high rates of disappearances of persons. It's something that occurs both during civil war and during peacetime.
Now, before we get started into the thick of the research, I want to just reference the title of your paper, The Things They Carry, Victims' Documentation of Forced Disappearance in Colombia and Sri Lanka. And you talk about, in the paper, papers, you talk about documentation practices. Maybe it would be helpful just for our audience to give us a sense of what do you mean by their papers or these documentation practices?
Yeah, so this is a little bit the origin story of the project, actually, because, Roxani Krystalli and I both have worked across a range of kind of post-atrocity contexts. And, one day over coffee, we're sort of, venting in the way that you do about the difficult things that you've seen and experienced in fieldwork. I was talking about having been in Sri Lanka recently and, this thing that happens when you meet with survivors where they inevitably have a plastic bag that they're carrying, and inside are, photos of their loved one that's missing, newspaper clippings of the thing that's happened to them, forms that they've filed in their search for this person. And this is something that's been constant across contexts, right? I've seen this in Uganda, I've seen this in Congo. Roxani, of course, had seen it in Colombia and elsewhere. And so we started to talk about the fact that, it was both devastating and fascinating that this is so similar across wildly different contexts, right? And the two that we've chosen to focus on here, Sri Lanka and Colombia, do have similarities in some ways, which is that, both of them experienced a very long-lasting civil war, both have high rates of disappearances of persons, but they're very different in key ways as well. And, for us, kind of an important way in which they were different is that Colombia has this massive functioning transitional justice process where, if you are a victim and you have the right documentation, that is a means to get redress. That is not the case in Sri Lanka. It's not been the case in some of the other places where I've seen this behavior. So, it's a little bit of a puzzle why it is that, people all around the world who have lost their loved ones and are engaged in the search for them engage in this very similar behavior.
That's fascinating. And I think you mentioned field work, and this is research that takes place in country context, in very difficult environments, and dealing with people who are victims of a serious trauma at the hands of the state where they live. So I think I'd be interested hearing a little bit about your research process. When you go to these contexts, when you go into Sri Lanka, do you find people who are happy to talk to you?
Yes. So this is a very complicated question. And I think it is extremely person dependent. So I am coming from a background as a human rights activist and lawyer. Obviously, now I'm an academic. I'm doing academic research. But my kind of practice and my interactions with people are very much informed by my past history. So, for example, I never ask people about their trauma. I never ask anyone to tell me, whether they've experienced war crimes, whether they've been raped, were they tortured. And the reason for that is that I don't think it's appropriate to do if you're not providing them with a benefit. So when I was an asylum lawyer representing people through the process of seeking safe haven, I was not happy to ask those questions, but willing to ask those questions because I knew that would go in the brief and hopefully, secure them with, the ability to live out their life in the United States. When I am in northeastern Sri Lanka, at most, what I'm offering to people is that I will relay what they've told me to Congress, or I will write it in a foreign affairs article, or 4 years from now, it will appear in a journal article or a university press book. And that, to me, is not an acceptable trade-off for putting someone through the secondary trauma of telling me about the worst thing that has ever happened to them, and indeed some of the worst things that have ever happened to anyone. So that's kind of the approach that I go in with. And I'm quite clear that I'm not asking people about that. I also am extremely deferential to whatever people do want to tell me, or to the possibility that they don't want to talk to me. So I would say, I've had experiences across the spectrum where, people's reaction is, I'm sick of talking to every white person that comes in here with a pen and a notebook, and, no, I don't want to talk about this. Fine. To people who are really kind of getting some catharsis out of, the ability to tell in their own words, for instance, what their belief about, the government's commitment to transitional justice institutions is, what their belief about kind of the role of the military in their community is.
And you mentioned a white woman with a pen and paper, and you are doing research in a country where you are a woman from the global north coming into communities where these are people of color and often live in very disadvantaged or repressed regimes. How do you think the people you interview see you, and do you think their perceptions of you affect the evidence that they say, or the kinds of ways that they talk and engage with you?
Yeah, so this is something that was really important to us to have explicitly on the page in this article. That is why this article is in the shifting first person, right? It's back and forth between me and Roxani, and whichever of us is reporting our research is speaking as I. And that's because, we do know that who someone is talking to determines what they're going to say, and are in some sense viewed as kind of representatives of the international community. That said, both of us work through trusted organizations on the ground. So I, in doing this research, worked in partnership with a Tamil human rights organization called Pearl, and that has its pluses and minuses, right? What it meant was for the people that are in their network and that they have good relationships with, I kind of appeared as someone who had been vetted, right? So, not just a random white woman with a pen and a clipboard. On the other hand, this is a community with wildly varying political views, beliefs about kind of the future of Sri Lanka, of the Tamil community within Sri Lanka. And if you work through, a specific organization, then you are kind of limited to who they have good relationships with. So, I, of course, speak very limited Tamil, am dependent on people interpreting for me, and on people being able to assure my interlocutors that it's safe to meet with me, that I won't ask them offensive questions, et cetera. So I'm very dependent on that relationship. And that means that the information that I receive is filtered through that relationship.
You are talking with people who have experienced trauma, and you're talking about very difficult subject matter, which puts your interviewees at a potentially very difficult position vis-a-vis you and the state with which they are actively engaging with. And this raises lots of questions about research ethics and how you conduct this kind of research and the sensitivities around it. Can you tell us a little bit about your view in this particular project about how you approached research ethics considerations?
Yeah, so this is a particular challenge in this context because best practices for anyone asking questions touching on trauma is that you be prepared with the ability to refer them to competent psychosocial services. And in the Sri Lankan case, the Tamil community in the northeast of the island is explicitly cut off from access to psychosocial services. And that is a strategic decision on the part of the state, because if these survivors were to speak to a mental health professional, what they would say would be evidence of war crimes, and the state categorically denies having committed mass atrocities in this context. So from the get-go, we were hindered in our ability to do this in the kind of most ethical, best practices honoring way. And what that meant for me was to be even more committed than usual to not asking people those questions, right? To keeping the questions steered away from, actual inquiries about what had happened to them, and focused instead on, their engagement with the state, their process of seeking redress, their expectations for the future. Now, many people who have experienced serious violations of human rights will bring that up anyway, because of course they will. It's on their minds all the time. And that's very hard, because you're definitely not going to say to a traumatized survivor, no, I don't want to hear about this. So, you often do find yourself, hearing those stories even when you've not asked them for them. I have training as a human rights lawyer, as a refugee lawyer, in working with victims of trauma. So I lean on that pretty heavily in those interactions. But I do want to stress that, what I should do in these situations is refer people to mental health professionals, and I'm not able to do that. And so, this does leave this research in a very ethically fraught position.
And it raises really interesting questions around the real challenges of doing this kind of research in very difficult kind of political environments, and the tensions between your responsibility as a researcher to the research as a whole, but also to the people who you are interviewing. So we've heard a lot about the research process, and I want to move on to talking about the findings. Let me give you an overview, a broad opening. What is your main take of the findings in this paper?
So I'm someone who, if you ask me about the findings, I'm just going to talk more about the research process. So, I'm trained in a very typically American, very positivist way, right? There are answers, there's capital T truth in the world, and we can find it through the rigorous application of the scientific method. But the longer I've worked in post-conflict contexts, post-atrocity contexts, and specifically in northeastern Sri Lanka, the more I've really started to struggle with what it means to purport to tell an authoritative story about events whose participants have been forcibly silenced. So, of course, there's this obvious methodological concern here, right? If people can't speak freely, you're potentially not getting good data in response to your questions. But I think there's also a much bigger ethical issue. So political violence anywhere, anytime, exposes, it creates, it reinforces deep fault lines within communities. And as a consequence, narratives about these events are often deeply contested and contentious. So I think it's always kind of a questionable endeavor to try to establish like a definitive historical record, given this dense overlay of politics and trauma that builds up in the aftermath of violence, particularly in the aftermath of mass atrocities. But that is so much worse in cases where people are prevented from being able to process this trauma as individuals and as a community, to establish their own narratives of what happened. As I was just saying a moment ago about the restriction on access to psychosocial services, the thing about northeastern Sri Lanka is that I've actually never seen a population so constrained from being able to work through what's happened to them. And, I've worked in Eastern Congo, I've worked in rural Cambodia, I have lots of comparators. One facet of that is this lack of access to psychosocial services. But linked to it is the fact that this population lives under militarization, under heavy surveillance, and speech about the war, and specifically about the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, is policed with the threat of violence. So given these facts and what they mean to the people on the ground, it feels remarkably insensitive to then say, I, an outsider who has interviewed 50, 100, 500 people, am now going to say what's happened here and why. And I think, when we talk about field research ethics, we're very focused on avoiding exposing research participants to harm. And obviously, that's like a critical threshold consideration that we all do need to take account of. But I think we also need to consider bigger questions about, what does it give to someone or what does it take away to tell their story, especially when they can't do it. Sometimes it's a gift, right? So, to take something that's been unspoken, unacknowledged, hidden, and make it public in a way that promotes recognition. But I think it can also be an injury. One more voice speaking over someone who's been silenced. So in a context like this, where people have been so forcibly and violently prevented from telling their own stories, I think of the task of research as less about speaking for them and, telling their truth, and more about making or maybe holding space for them until they can do it themselves. And that means doing something that is so foreign to all of us who are trained as positivist social scientists, which is highlighting uncertainty and contradiction rather than seeking to resolve it and wrestle everything into a coherent narrative. So you can see in this paper, unfortunately, I have a co-author who shares these ethical commitments. We don't attempt to tell a cohesive or coherent story about victims' documentation processes. Instead, we suggest that different victims engage with the papers of victimhood differently, and that the same victims may even engage by doing different things at different times. And we really feel like that's what's important to communicate here, this multiplicity and this kind of complexity.
Let's talk about the way then you have observed victims using these papers. And you make two distinctions in the paper: the strategic use of these papers and the more ritual use. Let's talk about the first one. What does it mean to have a strategic use of papers?
So I think, there's one very simple story here, right? Which is that in the last 30, 40 years, a transitional justice bureaucracy and practice has developed at the international level, which involves, certain recognized institutional forms and has certain recognized expectations that it imposes on victims. And so a lot of what we're seeing is victims very consciously engaging with that script and saying, okay, a Office of Missing Persons or a Truth Commission, whatever institution has been set up in my country, I now need to show through the accumulation of documentary evidence that I am the sort of person this institution is intended to provide redress for. So that's a very straightforward engagement with documents and in the practice of documentation for strategic reasons. I think there's also a kind of secondary strategic logic here, which is one I definitely have observed on the part of many victims in Sri Lanka. Roxani also saw it in Colombia, which is the use of documentation to rebuke the state, right? Not gathering the documents in the expectation that if you just reach a certain level of credibility, you will get your redress, but to show instead, look, I have gone to state organs 20, 50 times. I have filled out every form on the face of this earth. I have contacted every journalist. I have spoken at the UN, and yet still no one has told me where my daughter is, right? And that's very different, but it's still strategic.
And you also talk about the ritual of these papers, and that in cases where relatives of victims are not either intending to identify themselves as victim or claim benefit or rebuke the state, as you've just described, they do something very, very different with it. And that's about this process of keeping memory and keeping their relatives' memory alive. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is something that's just been so striking for me with the families of the disappeared that I've met in Sri Lanka, particularly, that this is a community that is extremely well informed about events at the international level, about the behavior of the Sri Lankan state. For many of them, they have a well-earned sense of fatalism here, right? That, the state is never going to supply them with redress. The international community is probably not going to do much for them either, but, kind of is their only potential outlet. And yet many of them continue to engage these processes. And I think, there's a couple of reasons for that. But to me, in most cases, it did have this element of ritual, right? That this is how you maintain this connection to the person who is gone. And what would it mean after 5, 10, or 15 years to suddenly stop, right? You've spent all this time accumulating these documents, seeking information. Some of these families have been in more or less continuous protest in the street for the last several years. This is how they spend their days. This is kind of the focus of their life's work at this point. How could you stop? You would feel like you were betraying the person's memory. And obviously, this is tremendously fraught. It makes people's kind of relationships with their living relatives difficult. It interferes with their ability to earn a living. But I think people all around the world, echo this, when they say that, they can't give up on someone who is lost. And even if they know their efforts are not going to yield strategic benefit, it is necessary to them to continue to honor the person's memory.
We've been talking about the experiences and the practices of the relatives of the disappeared. And this is clearly hugely important for those actors, those victims. I wanted to ask what you think the wider political implications of your research is. Are there implications for the governments or citizens in the countries that are directly affected, or indeed for international organizations, as you've said, have really set up kind of an institutional regime in terms of thinking about transnational justice?
Yeah, I think the kind of more productive angle here is at the international level, right? Because violator governments know what they've done and what they're doing, right? In evading accountability and refusing to provide information. But I think there's kind of information to be gleaned here that is relevant to the work of international organizations, because I think we can forget what the human cost of this type of activism is, right? I am someone who studies accountability for mass atrocities and its converse, which is impunity. And so often when we talk about impunity in international advocacy spaces, in social science spaces, we think of it as this negative condition, right? It is the absence of justice. But impunity is such an active condition for people, right? They're not just sitting and waiting. They're engaged in this constant process of trying to bring about redress. And, every additional year that goes by is an additional injury, right? It's not just that they've lost this person or they've experienced this atrocity. It's that now they've also, in the case of Sri Lanka, experienced over a decade of, continuing to hear denials from the state, of continuing to not know what happened. So I think, our hope with this research, at least, was to give a little bit of a lens into how people are actually experiencing this and what it is that it actually means to them.
Are international organizations then the kind of site for the research, as you're saying? Is there a sense that this kind of making clear or making known the experiences of these victims is going to matter in terms of the types of policy responses that international institutions employ or put to the kind of country offenders?
I think it's a hard kind of process, right? And then this is true of so much in the human rights realm, because the primary actor is the state, right? And, there is this rule, across international human rights of exhaustion of domestic remedies, which means that, even if the perpetrator that has, especially if the perpetrator who has abused your rights is your state, that's still your first recourse. You have to go to the state. You can't go to the international arena. And there's kind of limited ability of international organizations to shift the behavior of recalcitrant states. And, the ability to do that is dependent on political will, which doesn't necessarily exist in the international arena, especially after the 4 years we've just had. However, I think it matters. I think it matters to take victims' experiences seriously, on the margins, right? Like, if everyone who is doing this work has a little more insight into what it looks like to be engaged in this kind of activism, if other researchers who go to these contexts and run surveys there have a little bit more of a sense of who they're speaking to and what they've gone through, that matters. I have this conversation with my human rights students a lot, because most of what I tell them is so discouraging about the process for like big structural change and like policy revolution. But when you're talking about victims of mass atrocities, small changes that even if they only impact a few people, are life and death questions. So I think, for us, it was important to write this and important to publicize it, not because we necessarily saw direct paths to making policy change, but because we think those indirect paths can be so important.
Thank you, Kate. This is incredibly valuable research, and you've given us really great insight into it today. The paper that we've been discussing is called "The Things They Carry: Victims' Documentation of Forced Disappearance in Colombia and Sri Lanka." It's written by Kate Cronin-Furman and Roxani Krystalli, and it's published in the European Journal of International Relations. You can find full details about the paper on the UCL Uncovering Politics podcast. Next week, we are examining the concept of decolonizing the university. UCL, like all universities, has been working hard in recent years to come to terms with aspects of its past that it can no longer be proud of, and to develop a teaching curriculum that is responsive to needs and perspectives across the world. Such a process is raising big questions about politics and about power. We will be exploring them with our own Kathy Elliott from the Department of Political Science, alongside Subhadra Das, curator of UCL Science Collections, and Caroline Bressi from the Department of Geography. I'm Jennifer Hudson, and this has been UCL Uncovering Politics. In the meantime, please let me encourage you to subscribe, and you can do so on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.